Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Labott, a graduate student of the George Mason University Global Affairs Master's Program. This presentation is a funding proposal for my research on social media behaviors in the context of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news propagation. Beijing and Moscow is undermining Western-made vaccines and state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. Misinformed citizens participate in domestic acts of terrorism. Ebola virus outbreaks in one part of the globe increases fake news spread on the other side of the globe, and conspiracy theories contribute to the exacerbation of the public health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. The internet is rife with misinformation and disinformation that only seems to be unwittingly propagated through social media by people unaware of their misleading and potentially harmful nature. The 2016 United States presidential election put the term fake news at the forefront of the public consciousness, though despite more concern and focus on fake news, its propagation and production continued as mis- and disinformation reached and reformed the very belief systems people use to make significant decisions in their lives. This project is an analysis of social media usage and proposes a large N study of social media users to investigate other social media associated behaviors which might predict the propensities for not only fake news consumption, but also its propagation. With the prevalence of anti-vaccine sentiments and groups propagating misinformation that could directly impact the public's effectiveness in managing the COVID-19 pandemic, there is more emphasis on the importance of a better understanding of who is prone to spreading misinformation, how it is spread, and what might be done to mitigate it. Beyond the management of a pandemic, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and their spread continues to have real-world political, economic, and cultural consequences. These areas are the definition of misinformation, disinformation, fake news' scope, prevalence, and impacts on various domains and sectors. Dispositions and behaviors at individual and group levels that predict the prevalence and propagation of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, and interventions that might address these predictors, as well as the structural mechanisms that enable misinformation, disinformation, and fake news propagation. My research seeks to focus on the propagation mechanisms and the associated social and behavioral predictors that might increase the prevalence of misinformation, disinformation, and/or fake news. These mechanisms and social behavioral predictors that increase propagation are the focal point for structuring any interventions that hope to alleviate the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. For my research objectives, the proposed research outlines three major objectives in examining social and behavioral predictors in the propagation of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. For my first objective, it will be to examine the role of social media usage and the consumption and propagation of fake news. For my second one, it will be to examine any other behaviors within social media use that might correlate to fake news consumption and propagation. My final objective will be to examine the role social media contexts and their behaviors in terms of propagating fake news play into an individual's own fake news consumption and propagation patterns. I will use the dataset access provided by Social Science One, which is a partnership hosted by Harvard's Institute of Quantitative Social Science between Facebook and academic researchers that use Facebook data to focus studies on the social media effects on democracy and elections. The use of this extensive dataset of Facebook users and their social media activities, which include behaviors, social contexts, etc., makes this project a large N study by nature. Given the enormous potential for a variety of ways to analyze the data, this project seeks to organize, summarize, and prioritize data relevant to our evaluation's purpose, which is to achieve the objectives laid forth to answer our research objectives. To assess the first objective, which is to examine social media usage, duration, and frequency as it relates to fake news propagation behaviors, a review of the SSO dataset metadata for individual usage frequency, duration, and URL shares, clicks, likes, and all other engagements with URLs associated with fake news will be conducted. This review will explore the relationship between each variable to find any positive or negative correlation with statistical significance. A similar process will be used to assess the second objective, in that the same type of fake news content URLs will be compared against behaviors of the same individual in sharing behaviors, as well as social media group membership of those individuals. Finally, achieving the last objective will follow the same process, with the variables being fake news content shared within shared groups and through context compared against content sharing behaviors, such as the frequency of sharing and type of sharing, using similar parameters as Objective 2. The intellectual merit of this project lies in its contribution to three primary areas of research on misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. First, the definition regarding the scope, prevalence, and impacts of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, while not necessarily expanded on due to this project's use of established definitions, is broadened by understanding more in depth the relationship between the prevalence and impacts of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, and their propagation mechanisms and platforms. Second, the exploration of predictors, particularly social and behavioral mechanisms, which previously received little to no analysis, highlights factors contributing to one's exposure to misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, susceptibility to misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, and their propagation. Finally, this project helps inform possible implementations for individual, group, and structural interventions to mitigate exposure, susceptibility, and/or propagation of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. This is done through determining relationships between behaviors outlined in our objectives to find appropriate recourses for addressing them, whether those be through educational or structural and design interventions. I expect the broader impact of this project to be an increased understanding for the public on the implications of social media use and behaviors associated with sharing information on social media. I also expect this project to help inform public policy related to a few areas. Some examples would be through addressing the dangers to public health and safety that might be caused by misinformation and disinformation on information sharing platforms, such as social media. Another avenue would be through forming policies that promote critical media literacy educational interventions in public education. This concludes my presentation, and I thank you for your time.